Thank you so much, Monica, for inviting me here. It's a privilege to be addressing you all. First, I want to declare that I don't have any conflicts of interest. We developed home bimanual training, but this is something we only do in the context of research. We don't have a treatment center per se for this. I also just want to quickly acknowledge a large number of collaborators who have been involved in our cerebral palsy and our hemispherectomy research, and importantly, the funding we've received from the Brain Recovery Project, so we're very grateful for that. One of the things that I want to start off with to you is I want you to ask yourselves a question about whether you could do home training, and maybe more importantly, should you do home training, okay? And it's perfectly fine if the answer to either of those is no, okay? I'm not necessarily saying that you absolutely need to do this and you're missing something if you don't. It's just something for you to consider. And I'm going to go through some research studies, primarily concerning children with congenital hemiplegia, cerebral palsy, but also a project that we were funded to do with hemispherectomy, and then some home training we did with CP, and then kind of put it all together for you. So in cerebral palsy, there was a landmark review paper done a few years ago, and not much has really changed since then. And basically, they were quantifying all the known therapies that have sufficient enough evidence to recommend into clinical practice. And this is for focusing on the upper extremity, so the hand. And the reality is, actually, the only treatments that are available are for the hand at the activity level. But the reality is there's only 5 such therapies. Of these, we've worked on most of these except for Botox plus occupational therapy, but these include constraint therapy and bimanual training and home training and goal training as well. So other therapies may or may not work, but there isn't sufficient evidence to recommend into clinical practice as of yet. Okay. So there are 2 commonalities across all the therapies that seem to be working. One is they involve active movement using motor learning and neuroplasticity principles. We heard a bit about neuroplasticity earlier. And they're all relatively intensive, okay? Much more intensive than is provided in typical PT and OT sessions. So in terms of motor learning, you can kind of think of it as a triad where the person is influenced by the particular tasks or skills that are being selected, the performance environment, and the actual constraints of the individual themselves, their neural and physical circuitry. So ultimately, this highlights the idea that there can't just be one approach that's going to benefit everybody. Okay, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. What is needed ultimately is to have variability in practice, so you're varying the environment, you're varying the task, and you're ultimately requiring the individual to do problem solving to come up with their own solutions to perform tasks functionally. And this is really based on the idea generated from a neuropsychologist, Anne Gentile, that just telling them the movement pattern that you think is going to work isn't necessarily going to work, okay? Basically, the brain actually is remarkable at coming up with its own solutions based upon the constraints that it's facing. So basically, the idea is to use this triad where you establish the goal, you set up the regulatory stimulus, basically the environment and the tasks, and you let the individual problem solve how to best accomplish that. Neuroplasticity is also an important aspect of the successful treatments. It involves self-initiated movement. So when you think about robotic training, like exoskeletons that basically move, the individual, these aren't necessarily going to work because that's a passive approach. It has to involve active movement of the individual, and that involves mental and physical effort, intensity of training. Again, it can't just be repeating the same thing over again. As I mentioned, it requires variability of practice, and basically this practice has to be meaningful to the participant. So in the context of a child, that typically means some functional goals that they're interested in achieving or play. And then basically all this depends on the age, the intensity, the specificity of the training, and then again, the meaningfulness of that training to the individual. So intensity is also an important component. My colleague and friend at NYU, Karen Adolph, did a study of typical developing walking in toddlers. And she characterized what happens from the very first step that a toddler takes until they become proficient non-falling walkers. And she basically characterized, she found that toddlers take 14,000 steps a day. It's a lot, right? Equivalent to about 46 football fields, and they fall about 100 times per day. And that comes into the problem-solving component, is that basically there's an attempt, a failure, a reattempt, and then basically making that connection is super important. Ultimately, it takes about 1 million steps going from that first one to being a proficient walker. So that's a lot of practice. So when you think about that in the context of therapy, my colleague Catherine Lang at Washington University characterized in adult strokes how many repetitions were being performed in what the therapist would call a motor learning-based approach. She found for upper extremity training, it was about 32 reaches or grasps within a 45-minute session or so. And for the lower extremity, it was about 357 steps. So you can imagine for children who you really have to motivate to a much greater extent that the numbers are probably less than this in a given PT or OT session. So you can see the disparity, right? 1 million steps to learn a new motor skill, very few happening in given sessions, and that's the problem with the way that therapy is. The therapists have their hands tied behind their backs. Okay. We started to approach this about 20 years ago in congenital hemiplegia, CP, cerebral palsy. And we looked at the neuroscience literature to try to find out what was kind of driving improvements in motor function in animal models. And that goes back all the way to the 19th century. There are a number of psychologists, there are a number of neuroscientists, all basically showing that, again, intensity matters, and these principles that I've just shown you are important, successful aspects for generating neuroplasticity and improving motor function in animal models. In adults, Stephen Wolf at Emory, coming up on 40 years ago, was the first to basically create a forced use paradigm where he took adult stroke patients and put their better upper extremity into a cotton sling, sent them home, and basically they went about their daily lives for 6 hours a day in that sling, and basically showed improvements. Ed Taub at University of Alabama added some active training components, tying it into those animal models that I just mentioned, and he called this constraint-induced movement therapy. There was a very large trial run by Steve Wolf in about 13 years ago, and overall this has been relatively successful in adult strokes. So in the late 1990s, our group working in pediatric movement disorders worked with some of these people to develop a pediatric version of constraint therapy. Okay, and we were the first to do so in CPs. And we started with a case study series in the home, basically, and we published this in 2001, demonstrating that it has promise for basically improving motor function. Importantly, we adopted it. We use a cotton sling. We don't do any casting. We only have it for 6 hours a day, and we engage the kids in very playful kinds of activities. So since then, there's been a proliferation of studies, about more than 100 studies and more than 30 randomized control studies in cerebral palsy, demonstrating efficacy across a wide variety of measures. There's some evidence to suggest that constraint therapy works following hemispherectomies, and I'm going to come back to that in a bit. And there's lots of reviews as well in this area. Okay, so if constraint therapy works, well, why would you even consider doing a bimanual approach to training? So first of all, there's some limitations of constraint therapy. The lack of bimanual components means that you're not practicing the kinds of activities that you hope it to transfer to. You're not trying to develop a new dominant hand. You're basically trying to create a non-dominant assist like we all have. Most of the problems in daily life, therefore, are related to bimanual functions. And even in unilateral cerebral palsy, there are some deficits in the less affected or non-affected upper extremity that are not going to be addressed with constraint therapy. Our biggest concern back when we started doing this research, and we did it, and we still do studies on constraint therapy, so I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't do constraint therapy, but when we started publishing this and other groups started publishing these studies, some clinicians decided, oh, well, let's cast kids and send them home. And they're really missing the big picture about the active ingredient. It's basically the training, it's not the restraint. And the training makes that easier, obviously, but it's the active practice that matters. And, we didn't like the idea that people were just, sending them home, and that could lead to large frustrations. So we took an ingredient of physical and occupational therapy, bimanual training, and we structured it very much the way that we had developed the constraint therapy models in pediatrics. Basically, in this case, we do it in a camp model. We do it primarily 90 hours, so 3 weeks of 6 hours a day, so very, very intense. And we give children activities that necessitate the use of both upper extremities, mostly in the context of play. So we did a lot of studies about this, but this was one where we compared constraint therapy and bimanual training to see if there's any drawback from not having the constraint. On the left here is a test called the Jepson-Taylor. Basically, it's a time dexterity test where the faster the movement, the better across a series of manipulations. So basically, both the constraint in blue here and the habit group in red had about a 30% reduction in their time to complete the battery of tasks, and that this was maintained over the 6 months that we followed them. No statistical difference between either of these. On the right is something called the assisting hand assessment. It's a bimanual assessment, a videotape assessment, basically of the quality of bimanual, of affected hand use during bimanual activity, play. And we get an increase, and basically, again, and that's maintained for both groups, no statistical difference. So just because on average you get the same result doesn't mean that they are the same. They're not the same. There are best responders to both groups. We don't entirely know what these are, but there's also some differences. If you query parents about goals, kids that were in the bimanual training groups improved more on goals because typically more than 80% of the goals that parents identify are bimanual in nature. Also some coordination, basically improvements for bimanual coordination. When we look at movement tracking or motion capture, you get some advantages during bimanual movement for the habit group and some improvements for unilateral movement for the constraint group. So there is some specificity of training, but on average, basically from a clinical perspective, they both work. Okay. So it turns out that if we measure neuroplasticity, in this case, we take a magnetic coil, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and we stimulate the cortex, and if we get a motor evoked potential or a little twitch in the fingers, we know that that site is connected to the hand. So this is a standard MRI, and superimposed on this are all the sites of the motor cortex that elicited a little twitch of the contralateral hand in this case. And basically what you can see is that from before habit, this is also true for constraint therapy, but before these, basically there's an activation of a given size, red being the most intense, the strongest connectivity. One is right after training, you see that there's an expansion. There's a larger number of sites that now have taken over. So the motor cortex is plastic, neuroplasticity. And there's more red, basically stronger connectivity. And that's maintained for the 6 months that we followed these kids. So one of the issues in congenital CP, and this definitely pertains to hemispherectomy as well, there was a study basically a little over a decade ago by Martin Stout's group in Germany. And they looked at the effects of constraint therapy on in CP in kids who maintained projections from their lesioned hemisphere. The normal right brain controls the left brain and vice versa, versus about half the kids in CP have a reorganization. And that actually sometimes happens if your kids had a stroke prenatally or had congenital CP. There's probably a 50% chance that they already had one side of the brain controlling both basically both hands, okay? So this is called ipsilateral connectivity. The lesion hemisphere no longer has any connections. The other hemisphere takes over the role of the opposite hemisphere. So what they found is that kids that maintain the normal cross hemispheric communication or innervation of the hand showed improvement following constraint therapy. Kids that had this reorganization, not only did they not have an improvement, basically they got worse, okay? Now, to be honest, up until recently, we hadn't been looking at the cortical spinal tract connectivity, but there's a 50-50 shot that a kid has ipsilateral connectivity. The kids that have mirror movements, that definitely means that there's some ipsilateral connections. We've never, ever seen a kid get worse, okay? And this was a small study that they did, and this kind of prompted us to start thinking about, well, maybe there is some differences in terms of response to constraint therapy. Is that also true for bimanual training? So we retrospectively went back and we did the TMS basically to characterize the connectivity of the brain to the hands. And basically this is for habit. We found that kids that have ipsilateral as well as contralateral connectivity had large improvements, similar statistically improvements in the dexterity test that I mentioned. And then in the bimanual test, basically both groups improved as well. I should mention that if there's ipsilateral connectivity, they tend to have worse hand function than kids that have contralateral, but both of them improve statistically. Okay. So we just completed a NIH-funded project, again in congenital CP, to look at the relative efficacy of constraint therapy and bimanual training to see if there's a different response depending upon that connectivity. And I'm happy to report that basically, again, kids improved both from constraint and bimanual training, both for the unilateral and the bimanual components, but basically whether they had the persistence of contralateral projections or not, the kids improved in both cases. So it doesn't seem to hold that it's simply a neural circuit or this particular neural circuit that predicts outcome to either. So what about kids with hemispherectomies? And again, this is a project that was supported by the Brain Recovery Project. There basically is a case series study done by Stella DeBode, some of you may know her, basically showing that it's feasible and promising to do constraint therapy post-hemispherectomy, and demonstrated some reorganization of the sensory motor cortical representations similar to what I just showed you with CP. So despite its promise, constraint therapy might not be that suited to individuals who have more severe hand impairment. So constraint therapy is kind of forcing you to do activities that necessitate use of the affected hand. But if you can't grasp, or if you can't release, or you can't really do much with your hand, you're kind of limited to simple reaches and arm movements, and even that could be very limited. So the variety of tasks that you can induce basically might be more limited in this case, and it might cause frustration, basically, because you can't, enrich the environment, you can't engage in what kids ultimately want to do. So this motivated us to consider the alternative approach of bimanual training, which, again, I just showed you had similar changes in CP. And the idea basically is that we wanted to assess the effectiveness of bimanual training on upper limb function. So the study design, we had 13 children participate, 11 in New York City at Columbia University, and 2 from our colleagues at University of Louvain in Brussels, age between 7.5 and 16.5. Post-surgery, mean age of surgery was 6. Basically, well, I won't go through all the details, but it had to be a complete hemispherectomy. I know a number of you had basically contacted us about participation, and there were a number of inclusion and exclusion criteria that may or may not have allowed you to participate. Basically, the big component basically is that they had to at least use their upper extremity as a stabilizer. Okay, so like hold a piece of paper down while you're drawing. Okay, the most simplest form of hand use. The intervention was 90 hours, 3 weeks, over basically 3 weeks of weekdays, and then we engaged kids in these activities that I've already mentioned. We measured the same dexterity and bimanual hand function, as well as goals and survey of overall function. And we did some neuroimaging, diffuser tensor imaging, to look at tractography to see if the cortical spinal tract, there was any connectivity and to what extent that might predict the outcome. So I have to say that this was a pretty difficult project to do. We assessed 39 individuals who expressed interest. We excluded 11 basically for a number of reasons, but 12 individuals basically declined to participate, most of whom basically I think just couldn't come to New York City and basically they couldn't do it, logistical problems or family health issues. 16 kids completed physical screenings, and basically 3 after that still declined to be able to participate, primarily for logistics or other reasons, and then ultimately we ended up with 13 kids. All 13 kids completed the full 90 hours of training. They spent more than 90% of the time doing whole task practice. That means like engaged in games and play and function activities. Come back to that. So this shows you the black is the mean and the blue are the individual 13 kids for that dexterity test on the left. Again, so here we did 2 pre-tests and then a post-test after camp and then 6 months later. An important thing to point out here, and we've never seen this in congenital CP, is that just by doing 2 pre-tests, the idea was to try to see if there's a stable baseline, and there isn't. And that really cues us into the idea that, basically just practicing this test, the kids get better. So there's really a non-use, and just by simply using it, they get better. And that means that there's a lot of potential for improvement here. Following the treatment, on average, they continue to get better. In 6 months, the dexterity on average basically starts to go back towards baseline, but it depends upon the individual. An important aspect, we had the maximum time for this test is just over 1,000 seconds. And there were 8 individuals who had that maximum test, the maximum time, meaning that they just couldn't perform any of the tasks within the limits. Of those 8, 3 improved and 5 didn't show any improvement. And again, that kind of means that maybe for more severely affected hand function, that dexterity shouldn't really be the goal, okay? That you may or you may not be able to change that. The assisting hand assessment, the bimanual, again, you do get some practice effects here, which we've never seen in other populations, but there's continued improvement following the training, and in this case, it was retained over the 6 months statistically that we followed these kids. So I'm going to show you a video. Basically, there is sound, but it's not so important. But basically, this is assisting hand assessment. And you can see that the teen here is reluctant to use the affected hand as an assist, even to stabilize it. So post-training, you can see he more spontaneously engages the hand. It by no means is normal per se, but basically he's more aware of it and can use it as a stabilizer and comes up with effective strategies to be able to accomplish the task. I have one more video, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. An important aspect, we always query families about goals that they have, the parents and the children, in the case of older children, might have. And in this case, basically no changes simply between the 2 baseline tests, but we get a relatively large change following the training. Okay, so that means that in terms of the performance, parents perceive the performance of the goals that they've identified as being significantly better. 10 would be perfect performance, but they've gone from hardly being able to perform it to, not bad. Functional. And this is the satisfaction levels that they expressed with that, and in most cases they improved, and on average basically there was a good improvement with retention. Kids don't typically lose, if they can acquire a goal, they don't typically lose that. It's kind of like the bicycle, in that sense. And this is just a survey of how well they can use the hands across a variety of functions, and again, no difference in baseline here, but an improvement following treatment that is maintained over the 6 months that we followed these kids. So basically, there appears to be a feasible and could be a complementary or alternative approach to constraint therapy. Lateralization, we did look at the diffuser tensor imaging. It was a small population, but we didn't see any predictors of that in relationship to improvements. Basically, the improvements in bimanual function and goals could be related to the natures of the tasks that we do, and then future work needs to focus on neural substrates and look at this across a variety of much larger and more diverse population. So I'm getting to the point of the training at home, but in terms of the day camps that we have done, we've now done, we just finished this week 32 across the last 19 years, and basically we've had 300 participants in these camps. They're very efficient, they're somewhat cost effective, but not necessarily cheap. They're motivating, it's a social environment, it's fun, it's enriched. Basically, it's professionally administered and guided in this case. In terms of the child per therapist ratio, we've always maintained a 1-to-1 therapist per child ratio. That obviously will limit the extent that it can be, duplicated in non-research settings. For habit, I think you do need that ratio for constraint therapy. Maybe not. Might be able to constraint kind of is a babysitter in some ways. Basically, it's a fun participation. All right, so it still is relatively expensive, especially for that ratio that I just mentioned. You can't have kids below 4 participate in a 6-hour camp. You got naps, you got basically parent separation anxieties, and the youngest we've ever gone is 3.5, and I would say 4 really is the starting age. Duplication is difficult because you need space, you need staffing, and you need supervision. And we've been working with the Shriners Hospital system to develop some intensive training programs. And all the Shriners hospitals across the U.S. were extremely interested until they realized that these camps, they compete with their ongoing other outpatient activities. They don't have the space, they don't have the staffing, and they don't have basically even the play activities during normal hours. So that creates a problem. So it's not widely available outside of research, and there's a few sites in the Northeast that offer bimanual, and then constraint therapy is a little bit more diffuse, but still somewhat limited, especially on the West Coast and Midwest. So we decided to look at the effects of home training, in this case back to congenital hemiplegia. Okay, so basically to determine whether the caregivers could provide an alternative model for enhancing the number of hours and repetitions and so forth. And then we compared them to a control group receiving lower extremity training. So basically the hypothesis was to see if the home habit, H-habit group improves the quality of bimanual use, functional goal performance, and dexterity. So in this case, the age range, because we can go lower, started at 2.5 and it went up to 12.5. Basically, they had to be able to release and grasp objects. A big issue is commitment of the caregivers. You can imagine that we asked for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week for 9 weeks, because it's in the context of a research study. And this dosing schedule has been shown to be efficacious in home constraint therapy. So we wanted to see, all right, is that going to be true also for home habit? And basically, the caregivers need to likely not be working, unfortunately, so that obviously limits it even further, and also have daycare for other siblings if necessary. In this case, we had done a prior feasibility study where we did home visits once a week. In this case, we did remote supervision via internet once a week for an hour to help kind of problem solve and provide more fidelity and suggestions, advice. So this shows you the parent engaging in the
our bimanual training is to improve reaching, grasping, releasing, and really using the affected hand as an assisting hand. The movements are performed in the context of bimanual activities using child-friendly games. And caregivers perform these activities with their children 2 hours a day, 5 days a week for a period of 9 weeks to reach a total of 90 hours of training. And although the caregivers were responsible for directing the daily 2 hours of activities, an important component of the intervention was the supervision that we provided to families. in addition to daily monitoring of activity logs that caregivers submitted online, for each caregiver child dyad, we remotely supervise 1 hour of activities per week using an internet-based video conference software. And this really allowed us to provide feedback, suggestions for activities, and to model movements for caregivers. We also encouraged caregivers to avoid giving verbal prompts and instead to structure the environment in a way that would elicit use of the affected hand. The activities involved a high number of repetitions of movements, and we provided strategies for increasing the difficulty of tasks to match the increasing ability of the children.
Okay. So in this trial, of the participants, they completed the majority of training, averaging just over 80 hours of the 90 that we were asking for. But we had about a 25% dropout. Okay, that's a fairly large amount of families that we already went through surveys and a number of other things and scheduling to try to come up with, a way that they could do that. So it obviously isn't feasible for everybody. In terms of dexterity, this is similar to that Jepson test. It's called box and blocks. It's just simply how many blocks, little pieces that you can move from one side of a box to another. So the higher the number, in this case, the better across a 1 minute time period. Basically, we get improvement statistically for the home habit group and then the participants doing lower extremity training. There was a non-significant improvement. For the goal training, basically the home habit group and the control group improved their performance and their satisfaction, the parent satisfaction of that performance. But statistically, there was a greater improvements in performance for the kids that were doing the upper extremity home habit training. Now, this is an important component. So in our earlier feasibility study, the bimanual aspect that we looked at improved when we had these home visits in person. When we did the supervision via internet, it turns out that that didn't happen. So neither group showed improvements in bimanual hand use. And that means that, there is a strong need for having professional supervision, probably even in person, that you lose some fidelity via the screen in terms of doing this. It doesn't mean it's bad. I mean, basically improving dexterity and improving goals is great, and we don't expect parents to be therapists, but this might require just like the next step of, professional administration of the treatment. So home training, it's cost effective. Basically, you guys do the work for free. Places responsibility. So in one way, you could think of it as, it provides involvement time, one-on-one time with your child. Can provide intensity at an early age before the ability to participate in these day camps. Now, some problems that you need to think about, and especially in relationship about whether you can or should do this. It can be extremely isolating, spending 2 hours, and these were in half-an-hour bins, but nonetheless, like 2 hours doing activities with your kid that may or may not want to be doing this can be very isolating. So socially, this isn't a camp environment. Parents are not and should not be therapists. Okay, parents need to be parents. So the expectation about how much you're going to get out of that needs to be, reasonable. There's no question that putting the parent in the role of a therapist basically could influence the psychosocial dynamics between parents and the children and their family. So it's super important to be sensitive of that. We basically suggest that families carve out special spaces, carve out special activities, maybe wear therapy hats or something, or making it kind of fun and silly to say therapy time. And then the rest of the day, don't even mention the hand or anything else, and you're all used to, the whole prompting of use your hand. My mom still tells me to do things, and my reaction immediately is to do the opposite, as an adult. So you can imagine your kid is well attenuated to that. So that approach isn't going to work in the therapy, but especially if you're doing the therapy, back off that entirely. You want to see that transfer without you telling them. It requires space. Obviously, in New York City, that can be a problem. Requires a big time commitment as well, and then we don't know about fidelity without this supervision. So, to summary of this approach, basically, families complete the treatment, but we had a high dropout rate. We get gains in functional goal performance and dexterity. Unlike the personal visits, we don't get changes in bimanual performance. So it might be an additional tool. It's not going to be a replacement tool for therapy. And then the fidelity of training then becomes an issue. So a couple things that I want to emphasize. Historically, treatments have focused on, so this is the International Classification of Function and Disability and Health by the World Health Organization. And it can be classified into body functions and structures, activity, and participation levels. And historically, the body function and structure, so basically trying to make the hand or movements look normal, trying to get rid of spasticity, doing surgeries, and a number of things, basically. And that works in terms of like reducing spasticity or, basically making the hand look better. But in terms of function, this focus on this level doesn't transfer to the activity level. So the successful treatments thus far in CP have all been at the activity level, the constraint therapy and the bimanual and motor learning principles and so forth. But the question that I would pose to you is, how important is that versus basically having your child be able to participate in normal daily function, whether it be in the home or school or social environments? And there are a number of researchers. We developed a model of participation, basically, but the idea would be, do you do that activity training with the hope that this transfers to participation? Maybe, that's one solution. It could actually be that the participation itself becomes the adjunct to your PT and your OT. You get kids involved in sports activities. Basically, you engage them in rock climbing and swimming lessons, and you don't just constantly drag them from therapist to therapist, but basically you let them do after-school programs with their peers. And this in and of itself might go back to improving the activities. Might not, we don't really know. It's not going to have obviously the same resolution, but importantly, in terms of the kids, becoming independent, well-functioning adults, I think that, even if you're doing activity training, you need to be thinking about participation. This is ultimately where I think research is heading. Of course, everybody wants to normalize it and cure it and so forth, and that doesn't mean that the long-term goal shouldn't be that. But the short-term goal is to develop, healthy, psychologically, independent and happy adults. And I think that, putting too much focus on these and not enough focus on participation, could create a risk. So just to summarize, intensity matters, but it has to have the right ingredients. It's not intensity of anything. We don't know about 1 million repetitions, but it does require way more than what's given in therapy. Home training provides an opportunity for some families. Specificity, you want to train what you want to gain. The motor learning approach, focusing on the task rather than normal movement, seems to be effective. And now I want to just turn the attention briefly to the home habit. So I attached to on your schedule, if you click on the schedule online, you will find a home habit manual that basically I've provided for you. So you can open that up if you have a phone or something with you. But I'm going to provide you some general principles, and then I'm just going to skim through some important components of that, but you're free to keep those manuals. First, do it at your own risk. Use common sense. If there's an activity that requires marbles and you've got a toddler, think about what the kid might do with a marble. Use common sense. Again, carve out a special place, if you can. Make it, this is the therapy room, therapy activities, basically during that training, and consider some way of signaling training time versus mommy time. And I would never, ever, ever, basically turn into a therapist and not have that mommy and daddy time and so forth. Being a parent is way, way more important than being a therapist. The kids will get the therapy anyway. These kids need parents too. Outside training, again, don't focus on the hand at all. So basically, the parents need to kind of back off that aspect. You need to be parents. And then, in general, set rules about hand use rather than simply saying, use your hand, because you already know that doesn't work. And what we do in our camps, we start an activity, and we give the child who's old enough to decide some choice. We'll say, well, what activity, you can do this activity or that activity, and we're basically choosing from a select group that we think is going to benefit. And then we say, all right, so this activity, let's say it's a board game. You might pick a card and you might move a piece on the board or dice or whatever. And we'll say, well, which piece do you want to move the piece on the board with? Which hand do you want to use for that? Let them choose. All right, so lefty is going to pick the card, or roll the dice. All right, so we come to that agreement. And then, of course, during initial play, they're going to reach over and do the compensation that you always see. And rather than just keep reminding them to use the hand, we just kind of stop the game and playfully come back to, what did we just decide a minute ago? And let them come up with it. And it's like, are you going to do that now? It's like, we can only continue if you're going to do that. And then, make it into something that they have to do. And if it becomes, obviously, whatever they have to do has to be motorically feasible. You can't basically come up with a task that's too difficult for them. So whatever you're asking them to do needs to be within their ability. And make it fun, and don't force your child to do this. It's not going to work if you're constantly battling, and basically it's not a fun environment. So I'm going to turn this to your manuals, and I just realized that I might need to, could I have some help from the technical assistants to open up another file here? Is somebody still here? Nope. Okay, I'll see if I can do this. Oops. All right, this might work. All right, and nope, that's not showing. Okay, so if you have access to your manual, you'll need to open it up there because it's not showing on this. So first of all, so this manual, I'm not going to go through all the details of it, as I said, but I just want to highlight some points that, for you to think about, and then you can read through, and of course you can email me and ask questions. So ultimately, so on page 2 at the bottom, if you have the manual in front of you, the goal of Habit is to have children use their affected hand basically more spontaneously in bimanual activities. And overall, basically what we want to emphasize is the activities have to be active use of both hands, but particularly the involved hand. And we want it to be fun and performed in a positive environment. So basically it should be rewarding them for use rather than, kind of punishing or constant prompting. So that means that the parent needs to be creative. Okay, that's a challenging aspect of this. And we came up with a list of activities, but by all means, you can change these out and choose things that that your kids like. And then basically, you want to encourage the movement of both hands with these activities. So on page 3, an important aspect of both constraint therapy and Habit is skill progression. And skill progression is really the key ingredient that drives the neuroplasticity that I showed you in that CP study. So it can be defined as a training approach where the goal is achieved in small successive approximations. So basically, you build up the goal in small increments, and you constantly, you increase the spontaneous use of the hand by, as the child becomes better, you continuously change the environment. Again, that triad of the child, the environment, and the task, basically influencing the motor tasks. But basically, you want to constantly challenge them so that as they become more proficient, you make it slightly more difficult. Not so difficult as that they fail continuously, but basically, you might move, if they're having a hard time reaching, they become successful at reaching and within a certain distance, you start placing objects further away. Or if they're having a difficult time supinating, it's simply basically you take an object and you're in the context of a game and you just tilt it slightly. They're going to tilt themselves initially, and that takes a lot of energy, and eventually they'll begin to practice on their own without you saying anything. That's really kind of using the environment to drive the desired behavior. But you always, and that's the trick about whether it's constraint therapy or Habit, is that you always need to be thinking ahead of what your child's going to do and how can I present the task in a way that's going to accomplish the movement of interest. So basically, you're going to change the environment to basically increasingly involve more difficult and challenging, complex activities as they can do it. So little by little, as you notice improvements, basically the task is made more difficult, and it's this skill progression itself that ultimately becomes the therapy. It isn't necessarily the successful accomplishment of every task. It's actually making it more difficult and having them practice that. So in the context of a card game, for example, they might have a difficult time picking the top card. So you can bevel it, right? You just basically push it out slightly, and as I said, you can move it on the table to where you think that, you can challenge the reaching within their ability. And then as they get better, basically you can continue to increase the distance or change the location. You can change the height. Sometimes we put like a stack of cards up on a box or something. We don't say anything, we just put it there, and the kid has to basically figure out a way to get their hand and arm to that location. And then as they get better, we can constantly change each of those to make it more difficult. Always using positive reinforcement, verbal praise, basically, and regression should not be punished. You basically need to just regroup and think about a different activity, but that can't be stressed enough. It really has to be something that's a fun experience. Again, you're the parent, and you don't want to be, put into the situation of, having the kid resent you for doing this. So on page 5, about frustration, again, it's best not to push them and make them more frustrated. Ultimately, you need to, even though the goal is to keep changing the difficulty, it always has to be within some level of success, right? Because you can't have them, stop or not want to do it because of their repeated failure. So you should not take your hand and guide it. It has to be their own initiation. So remember, I mentioned variability of practice and problem solving. It's them coming up with the solutions, and if they can't come up with the solution, you need to make the task easier in that case so that they basically can accomplish it. And then ultimately, you need to create ways to provide a signal to your child that it's training time, as I said. So basically, training time, parent time, okay? And they should be not the same thing. On page 6, so a big question that you should have is, does it take 90 hours? Do I really need to do this for 90 hours? And the reality is that we don't know. We know that 90 hours in congenital hemiplegia is the key number on average. We know that can be distributed to 2 hours a day over 9 weeks. We don't know what happens if you spread it out over a longer period, but ultimately it's all cumulative. So even if you're talking about half an hour a day, 4 days a week, that's just more movement than they would have gotten, okay? And we're not talking about, as I said, a cure. We're talking about incremental progress, and hopefully in the context of something that's enjoyable for you both. So do what you can, okay? And if you can't do it, don't worry. It's no big deal. You can't. That's fine. So we don't know about the lower dosages and more distributed, but as I said, it's cumulative, and you'll need to figure out the right balance for you and your family. So starting on page 7, I list a whole bunch of activities, and these are just, a subset of many, many different things that you could have, and then, there's different play activities that you could do across different ages, and basically some items that you can buy on page 11. You probably have many of these. And then starting on page 12, I start to go through a number of these activities and discuss how you would actually perform it and how you would potentially progress the difficulty in making this more complex, basically how to progress the skill itself. So anyway, there's a lot of different activities there for you to go through and to consider. So I want to just wrap up, and then I'll answer some questions. I know it's lunchtime. So a little bit of advice about all of this. So basically, as I mentioned, it's intensity, and you're just trying to figure out ways of, accumulating that intensity over whatever time period that you have. And remember, it's a long period of development. It just isn't something that has to be done in a 3-week period. It isn't something that, you have to accomplish in 6 months. You've got a whole, long period of development, and you need to pace yourself accordingly. Participate in research if you can, if it's convenient and feasible. Everything can potentially help us and help you. Good things happen over time, so basically don't get discouraged if whatever you're doing isn't working. Don't overdo it. As I said, it's your family that matters. It's not, just, the hand function. The hand function will be what it's going to be. And be parents first as a consequence. So maybe a big issue is smell the roses, smell the, 99% of things that are perfect, okay, things that are just amazing about your kids, and keep your mind on that, and you're basically the focus, and that, the idea is that the late bloomers smell better. So, thank you.